Hello, Vikings. How are you today? Today's lesson is going to be on federalism. We're going to look at how the power of the national government is shared a lot of times with the state and local governments. Sometimes the state governments are denied powers, and sometimes the federal government is denied powers, and sometimes both of them come in conflict with one another. So we'll take a little tour here of an introductory lesson on federalism. So we've looked at many of the articles of the Constitution throughout the year. This one involves Article 6. If you remember, Article 1 was the legislative branch, Article 2 was the executive branch, Article 3 was the judicial branch. So here we are looking at Article 6, and basically it mandates that the actions or laws by the national government are supreme. So we will learn that if a state law comes in conflict with a federal law, depending on a court order, but most of the time the federal law supersedes the state and local law. So once again here, any conflict between a legitimate action, that's why sometimes courts get involved, the national government and state will be resolved in the favor of a national government. So that's known as the Supremacy Clause. We kind of talked about that a little bit in our Constitutional Convention. And we'll go over some shared powers and some denied powers. So there's basically three forms of government systems around the world. You have a unitary government where power comes from the central government and trickles down to the state government. So the central government is holding most of the power in that system. A confederal government is where the state governments cede power to the central government. And we have a federal system of government where you see that powers are shared between the state and central or national government. So once again, a federal system is where these powers are divided. We have state powers, we have local powers, and we have federal powers. We kind of went over this a little bit with federal laws, state laws, when we looked at the judicial branch. So we're going to see some of these powers are distinct, some are written out. We've already also looked at that when we looked at the legislative branch in Congress. So what's the purpose of this? Look, the founding fathers, as you remember, especially the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, were arguing over who would have power. They all wanted to limit the power of the national government, but they wanted to combine. They realized that they would have to have some sort of stronger national government after Shays' Rebellion, and they wanted to combine that with strong enough state governments to maintain order in the states. And of course, the Anti-Federalists championed more power to the states. So this was a compromise reached at the Constitutional Convention. This is territory we've already covered. They wanted to retain the state traditions. Many states in our union today still proudly do not want their traditions trampled on. And look, even over 200 years ago, the 13 colonies was a large area to govern. It's hard to govern from one central place. So you cede powers to the states. And obviously with 50 states today, it's an even larger territory to govern. So let's look at some of the powers that are delegated to the national government. You're going to have to do an exercise later with this. So we learn the enumerated powers in Article 1 are specifically spelled out. They're highlighted here in red. You could review it for a second on your own for some of these specific powers that the Constitution gives the federal government. You can reference this PowerPoint too when you have to fill out a worksheet associated with state, local, and federal powers. The implied powers, these are the ones not specifically spelled out, the necessary and proper clause or the elastic clause, where, these are implied powers. Even though it's not spelled out, Congress can make laws that are what are termed necessary and proper to carry out the powers vested or reasonably inferred in the Constitution. This is where often courts get involved as well. And the inherent powers gives the nation's ability to act in its own interest, making treaties, waging wars, seeking trade, acquiring territory. So these are some of the powers delegated specifically to the national government. So let's look at the states, okay? Remember that 10th Amendment. We didn't cover this too much when we looked over civil liberties, but we are going to cover it in this unit. These were powers reserved to the states. If the powers aren't declared in the Constitution or granted to the national government, they are reserved for the states, and we will go over many of them. There's also specific powers denied to the states. We'll get into this a little deeper later. So we'll give you some specific examples with that. And this is something you'll have to complete in your worksheet that we'll give you in our upcoming activity. So some of the powers to state governments. Most police power is reserved to the states. We are protected here by the Parsippany Police. That's a local police department sanctioned by the state. It's not a federal police power, okay? Also, legislation that involves marriage, education, state and local contracts, land use, those are powers delegated to the state. When you get married, you'll have the state, you'll get a marriage certificate from the state you get married in. Education, you're in the state of New Jersey, and your local board of education is Parsippany. So this is run by the state. Voter qualifications and elections are carried out by the state, even though we have an amendment now that allows 18-year-olds to vote. So that's why you have an amendment that the states have to go by. Otherwise, they determine how the election is going to be carried out. The county clerk, the Essex County clerk where I live, is going to allow in this upcoming presidential election mail-in voting. They determined that, not the federal government. Okay. Powers of the state government. The National Guard is controlled by the state government. It's, what the state militia was termed when the Constitution was written. And they have the right to regulate commerce that's called intrastate. This is a typo here. Regulate commerce in its own borders. That should say intrastate. Interstate is between two or more states. Okay. And the big one is making state laws. All your state laws are obviously made here by the state of New Jersey, your legislative bodies here, the Assembly and the State Senate, and the governor. Now, there are shared powers. They're called concurrent powers, okay? Now, when these shared powers come into conflict again, once again, the federal law trumps the state or local law. Some of the concurrent powers, taxing. Unfortunately, you pay federal and state and local taxes. So all the governing bodies usually tax. Borrowing money. State governments also can borrow money. You're well aware of how much the federal government owes, over 20 trillion and counting. Chartering banks. We have state banks. We have federal banks. And also law enforcement. Yeah, we talked about police power is mostly reserved for the states, but we've also talked about the FBI, which is a federal police. Okay. We have courts, state courts, local courts, and federal courts. We covered this during the judicial branch. Okay. So those are shared powers. And here they are in a nice chart for you. These are powers just for the national powers. States can't declare wars, guys. They can't print their own money. Concurrent powers, these are some shared powers. Nice chart here for you. A little hint, you're going to fill out a chart like this that I'm going to give you later, so you might want to refer to this. Hint, hint. And here are some powers left for the states: regulating trade within, public schools, regulating alcoholic beverages. Okay, these are the powers that are denied. Okay, this applies both to the national and state government. We learned in our constitutional convention that the government cannot tax exports. That is a power denied to the federal government. Our founding fathers put that in the Constitution. State governments are prohibited from conducting foreign policy. So Governor of New Jersey is not going to be making deals with foreign powers. Okay. Granting titles of nobility. Obviously, that came out of our revolution. So sorry, guys, none of you are going to have titles of nobility. No kings, queens, dukes are in your future here in the United States. Okay. And you can't jail citizens without a trial. So let's look at a couple of cases here that involve federalism. Sometimes federalism power the government grows. Sometimes the courts pull it back. These are a couple of big cases that came early that started challenging federal authority. Okay, McCulloch versus Maryland. United States Constitution doesn't say anything about a national bank. So this is where one of our first big conflicts comes into play. As you know, first and second banks in the United States were chartered. Hamilton is behind the first. They get rid of that. They establish a second bank. A lot of state banks are upset with that. So the state of Maryland imposed a tax on the Second Bank of Baltimore, which was a national bank. Okay, so the federal bank said you can't do this. So when it came time to pay the tax, the cashier said, we are not paying. You don't have a power to impose a tax on the national government. So it goes to the United States Supreme Court. So the key issue is here, the constitutional question is whether the national government had the implied power to charter a bank. It's not an enumerated power, we know, because it's not written in, but the national government is arguing this is an implied power, okay? So the other question, was it constitutional? Could a state tax the bank? Can a state tax the federal government? So two big issues here. So Chief Justice John Marshall held that the government had the authority to set up a bank. This is an implied power. So this obviously increased the power of the federal government. He also ruled that no state had the power to tax an arm of the national government. So here you have the Supreme Court ruling in favor of the national government. Some states' rights. Let's look at, for most of the early part of our history, states' rights prevailed, okay? And look, Jackson came along and got rid of the national bank again, as you know, and he brought, more tradition back to shifting power back to the states, okay? So under John Marshall's court, we see the federal power expand somewhat, but that's going to start receding under Andrew Jackson. Okay, so the North and South continue to have numerous disputes over commerce, tariffs. The South especially looked at this as benefiting the northern states. Slavery also, as you know, well throughout your study of history, was dividing the North and South. So we have a civil war. South Carolina repealed its ratification of the Constitution. They secede from the nation. The 6 southern states form a new government called the Confederation States of America, and they are defeated. And obviously there's going to be a lot of fallout from this defeat, but one of them is the supremacy of the national government really has not stopped growing since the end of this war. The 20th century, you especially see the power of the national government, especially when you get to the New Deal era, and really it has continued ever since. So dual federalism is a debate over the division of powers between the federal and state governments. They still continued, to have differences, but the national government is going to continue to gain more power. So when we get to the New Deal era, when we have the Great Depression, we're going to see more cooperation between the states and national government because there's more complex problems. And this is going to help the government become even stronger. What is it? Money. Federal grants. The government now, when it gives a federal grant, they usually put strings attached to it. For instance, let's look at education. You guys have to take a test every year. It's called PARCC now, even though you didn't have to take it in 2020 because of the coronavirus. Look, how does the national government get the state governments to take that test? Well, they will withhold federal funding if we don't have some sort of state testing for K through 12. I'm not sure if you have it in kindergarten, but obviously starts in your elementary years, continues throughout your junior high and high school years. And that's how they are able to impose their power. Same with federal highways. The reason the drinking age in the United States is 21, hey, it's not in the Constitution, but the federal government has said no federal funding for your federal highways if your drinking age is under 21. So those are examples of strings attached, okay? That comes with welfare, education, healthcare grants, things that states have to have. A lot of times the federal government say, oh yeah, you want them, you have to do it. You have to do these type of things or adhere to these type of requirements or restrictions imposed by the national government. So, though that is what's helped increase the power of the national government. So here's a chart that kind of shows you how the share of non-military spending on the federal, state, and local governments before and after the New Deal. Okay. You see the local is 60%, state and federal. Okay, the federal has a small piece of the pie there. They're going to start getting a larger piece of the pie here. After that, you see it goes up to 47%. So, the local and state governments are competing for this piece of the pie, and those grants give the federal government more power over the state and local, or at least influence. Okay, so here's a chart, and you can see the federal government, when it comes to spending, has increased, and that has also increased their influence. Here's an increase of federal aid to state and local governments since 1950. And that, when we get the 2020 stats, it's going to be even higher. Look, you see governors now with the coronavirus are pretty much rallying now to get more federal aid because they're going to have big holes in their budgets due to the lack of tax revenue that's going to be lost. People unemployed, more health care needed. So you're going to see that possibly even go up even further in the next decade. So if you look at it here, federal percent of the budget now on spending has gone from 17% in 1929 to 66%. So state and local governments are increasingly reliant on federal grants to fund their budgets. Where does a lot of this money go? Once health, medical assistance, Medicaid, things like Medicaid, unemployment insurance, retirement aid, welfare, highways, housing and urban development, collection of taxes, All of these things are where a lot of the um, federal government's money goes to. Okay, I hope that this was informative and a good introduction for federalism for you. You probably want to refer to this as you fill out some activities I'll give you in the next week. But I hope everybody has a good day, and thank you for tuning in.